not only is it profitable for us, but it has to have value to the farmer. What we provide to that farmer that is going to use it on their cows, be they beef cows initially, which is where we are, or dairy cows in the future, it has to have a value equation for them. They have to put money in their pockets. It cannot be a tax to them, cannot be a cost to them. It is a cost initially to purchase it. They have to be able to recover that value back, either in higher farm gate prices for the beef or milk, because it's now low in impact. We know that if you don't burp methane out, the carbon stays inside the cow that would normally be burped out as methane, and it provides a greater degree of efficiency. That's now being borne out in other independently run studies. So potentially there's a feed savings for the farmer to get the same amount of protein. And of course, there's value to the carbon that's reduced, or the methane carbon equivalents that are reduced. The combination of those has to put money in the farmer's pockets. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
Well, welcome back to the Decarb Connect podcast. And I am really excited by today's session for two reasons. One is I always love talking to disruptors, as anyone who listens to the podcast knows. And the second is this is just slightly different for us because it's specifically about methane and the development of a technology platform called CH4 Global with the founder and CEO, Steve Meller. So Steve, hello. Thank you very much for joining us from Vegas.
Hi, Alex. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be able to talk with you today and share some of what we've been doing in our journey. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to start you off with the question that regular listeners will have heard before, which is just for you to describe a little how you've come to this point in time, but not just professionally, not just how the company's come to be, but how have you come to this point in time and to this particular issue?
So that's you used the word in your intro, disruptors. And in my younger days, I never really set out to be a disruptor, although friends would probably call me that everywhere, all the time anyway. But professionally, my career has gone through sort of three phases. I have a PhD, so I have a research phase of my life, both in Australia and the US. It's what brought me to the US 36 years ago or so. I had a corporate life in a Fortune 50 company. And then for the last dozen or so years, I've had a entrepreneurial life. I've done it in an order different than most people do. But as it turns out, each of those phases has really been focused on disruptions in markets, in science, in technology, in some way, shape, or form. And I never set out, but I guess it's inherently part of me, and it's the part of what makes me tick. So it's exciting to be doing this again, I suppose, and that's sort of how I got to where I am, at least personally.
And so how did CH4 come to be? What was the kind of origin?
So it was one of those things where a confluence of circumstances came together in a disruptive way, I suppose. I happened to be in New Zealand and had just given a talk and went to a lunch session afterwards, which I typically wouldn't go to, but I was listening to some politicians talk about climate impact in the South Pacific. A couple of New Zealanders who I had dinner with the night before, as it turned out, and some ministers for climate change and a prime minister of some Pacific islands. And I was listening to them talk passionately about rising sea levels and the impact on communities. And the prime minister shared vivid pictures of building dam walls and talked about permanently relocating people to Fiji, and asked what was intended to be a rhetorical question at that stage: what would you all do if you had a year left? And there was an incredibly embarrassing silence in the room. Nobody spoke. Now, he has more than a year, but it was more for the impact of the discussion. In parallel to that, I had been doing in my post-retired corporate life, my entrepreneurial phase, some consulting of sorts for various Fortune 100 companies and governments, as it turns out, on disruptions and on sustainability, really the confluence of these two events. And the Australian government had asked me to come and rank order the top 10 innovations, top 10 disruptive innovations inside of CSIRO's portfolio. And some of the work that had, pardon me, had been focused on seaweed that had been going on in secrecy really was the fundamental core that we now work on. So I learned of that very early on. I'm listening to someone talk about impact of climate change. I, at that stage, lived in California, where a state bill had just been passed mandating a reduction in emissions from the state's dairy cattle, 1.6 million cows. So I knew there was a product, that it was safe and effective. I knew there was a market, at least in California. And so in my head, I said, look, I can solve your problem if we can grow this seaweed, this asparagus, this unique aspect of the seaweed at massive scale. So the company was born that day. And 5 years later, we're now at the point of bringing it into the commercial world and scaling it. So
I remember when we did our prep call for this, one of the things that struck me about our conversation is that you're clearly someone, and you spoke about it in that intro about those 3 phases of career. You're someone that can deep dive into something from an R&D perspective, but you're also a systems guy, aren't you? And we're going to talk a little later about the value chain approach that you're bringing this. But the other thing that struck me was some of the numbers that you put out there. So I remember you saying 12 gigatonnes of methane produced by agriculture. So before we go a little bit more into the red seaweed, what were some of the other routes that could have been, explored in taking on that number? If that was your focus, that was the piece you felt, okay, I could go after that. What are some of the other routes for managing that? And then we'll dive in a little more to the red seaweed research.
So it's an interesting question. And you made me, when you talked the first piece, made me think of a phrase for myself. I tend to describe myself as I know a little bit about a lot of things. Now, what's good about that, and I know some things in depth as well, but if you know a little bit about a lot of things, it helps you to connect things in some very interesting ways. And I think that's part of the path and the insights of disruptors is they're well-versed and well-read and integrated in a variety of different ways. For us, and often technology platforms or new products or new categories start with you either start with here's an approach that could be disruptive, let me figure out what a market is, or here's a really big market, let me figure out how to solve it. The latter usually works out better at the end of the day. And we were sort of somewhere in between, to be honest. It's really that piece. It's like I knew there was a market, but I wasn't out there. It's not that I knew there was a market and said, I now need to find a way to solve that market. It wasn't like I had a new technology and what market can it fit into? I didn't have either of those things. I just knew them. They were part of these. I know a little bit about a lot of things. I knew a little bit about what was going on in this technology platform in CSIRO because I was under NDA, evaluating it and many others. I knew a little bit about what was going on in California because it had been in the news recently. And I just happened to be in that point, physically, geographically, in New Zealand, where these things came together. It's like, wow, here's a technology platform. It's going to fit with this big market. I knew there was a big market. I needed the technology. Let's put them together and create the opportunity. So it was really an unusual circumstance where both pieces were visually inside of my head right there at the same piece. I had to merge them. So I didn't have to say, great market, let me go find a way to do it, or got a great technology, let me go figure out where it plugs in. They just fit together at that moment in time. So that's how we sort of started.
So it's not like you weren't looking at, here are 5 or 6 different routes to managing methane in agriculture. No. It really was just joining the dots of the things that you were seeing, hearing, understanding. Yeah, okay, interesting.
That's us. And the company is 100% focused on this approach, right? It's not like we're going to pivot to something else. This is what we do. Now, the core of solving the problem is what we do. The technology platform might modify and change as it already is, but it's the core of the problem now. So,
okay. So just briefly, and then we'll talk a little more about the scaling up of this subsequent to this question, but just what was the origin of the red seaweed research? So obviously you mentioned you'd come across it when you were under an NDA and you were exploring lots of different elements that the Australian government had been looking into, but what was the original, how would they even come into red seaweed as an answer to anything?
So it's somewhat convoluted and across multiple geographies. And I think folklore, so to speak, would tell variants of stories, as it always does. But I think central to the core of all of this is a researcher by the name of Rob Kinley, Dr. Rob Kinley, who was then in Canada, Eastern Canada, and a seaweed farmer called Joe Dorgan, who, sorry, a cow farmer, I apologize, who noticed that his cows were eating seaweed, not red seaweed, not asparagus, to be really clear. That's one of those things in folklore that seems to get a little blurred. And he went into the university and said, my cows look healthier. They seem to be doing really well. What's going on? So that led Rob into his scientific investigations to better understand the mechanisms behind that. And it's sort of, again, like everyone's scientific careers, his PhD research background, it sort of broadens. You ask more and more questions, you bring in other pieces of science, and that got him really more interested in seaweed. And he ended up being recruited by and went to Australia, CSIRO, Australia's National Science Agency, to the town called Townsville in northern part of Queensland, which is just off of the Great Barrier Reef. And when he got there, he still had this passion and interest. And right next to them, in the same town, was James Cook University. And so, he knocked on the door. Rob's version is he knocked on the door and sort of said, hey, can we go collect some seaweed? Now, I'm interested. There was a lot more obviously in there. So they went and collected a variety of different species, came back. He had a model that was called an artificial cow stomach model. It's not, it doesn't look like what you might picture. It's a bunch of test tubes and scientific apparatus, but you simulate it and you use ruminal fluid from a real cow to be able to do some of this understanding. So you can see what's being produced, what gases are in there, how it interacts. And so it's a fairly standardized model. And Rob ran all of the different seaweeds through there, and most of them had effectively no effect. A couple of them had a little bit, small amount, single digit, maybe low double digit reductions in methane. And one, he ran the study overnight, came in the next day, and it appeared that it completely shut down all methane production. He said, I don't believe that. Ran it a couple more times, got the same result. And so here was this revelation that this particular species, out of 10,000 species around the planet, this particular one appeared, it likely doesn't, but it appeared to have this unique facet of this dramatic effect. And so that was really the fundamental observation that's really led from the science. And of course, they did a whole lot more. They did a lot more in vitro on the lab bench. They turned to a group called Meat and Livestock Australia, who funded some of the early trials they did in sheep initially and then in beef cows, both showing the same dramatic reductions. Back then, we didn't know a lot about the science. We didn't know what those actives were. We didn't know how stable they were. You didn't really know much about how to turn that seaweed in the ocean into a product that's going to have this benefit reliably and consistently. But the observation was there and the effect was profound, larger than anything that has existed in the past, anything that exists today, right? It is at the pinnacle of the types of impact you can have, which has made it really exciting. And it's brought in a huge amount of understanding in many different research institutions around the world. It's brought out many new companies that are focused on this mechanism because it's such a profound effect and it's such a large impact. You had mentioned at the start 12 gigatonnes. I just want to clarify for the listeners, it's 12 gigatonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents, not 12 gigatonnes of methane. It's carbon dioxide equivalents. We all think in the carbon dioxide equivalents, the impact of fossil fuels and carbon dioxide. So there's a conversion factor that's used, that's well accepted, that's put out by the United Nations in a variety of publications. So it's a big effect and it's a big space. It's brought on a lot of knowledge, new knowledge, which is an exciting time really for the world because we haven't been successful as a species at reducing CO2. We have all sorts of things that we're doing around the world, but fundamentally, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere keeps going up. It only abated during COVID when we effectively shut the world down. And then it only dropped a couple of percent. And we need to reduce it close to 50% from what it is today. And we haven't made any progress on it. Methane, on the other hand, we can make progress. The largest are cows burping. It is the single largest source, period. Second largest source, but close behind, is from the oil and gas sector. What we use here in Nevada for hot water is natural gas, heats the water. That's methane. So we use a lot of it, and some of it escapes. And so that's another portion over here. But we know how to address those today. We don't need a new invention, a miracle to happen. We don't need new industries to change how we live our lives. These can be done, and done at scale today, which is the exciting part about what we do.
Okay, so then let's go into the next phase, because there are, I mean, whether it's CO2, whether it's methane, whether it's any kind of emission, the world is full of great technologies, great ideas, great evidence, but much harder to see where those are scalable, commercial, really truly commercial technologies in the making. You are actively showing that there is, through your work, a truly commercial marketplace, and something that you're able to scale. So how have you gone about that? Can you sort of just, I mean, if you imagine there's another disruptor listening and an investor, like, how do you talk to them about the route that you're taking to scale from that fantastic idea, a boatload of evidence, into a product that's really marketable at scale? What is that process you're going through?
So as a startup company, we have what I would call a significant advantage compared to many startup companies that start every single day in any sector. Some would call it a disadvantage. In this particular case, it's absolutely an advantage, because remember, we're building a scalable manufacturing process. Yes, we have a fundamental core technology that we need to understand fully, but it's a scalable manufacturing process. So our leadership team for the company are folks that I've recruited, for the most part, from my past in global companies. And so we have close to 150 years of commercial, large company experience at building new brands, new products, and in some cases, new categories. And you learn a lot from that over those century and a half. You learn a lot of mistakes, you learn a lot of what to do and what not to do. So we have the advantage of doing that. Now, our last 5 years has been a very targeted, question-driven journey. Phase one was, can we know enough about the seaweed, its life cycle, its physiology, how it stores these profoundly acting bioactives? What are they? So it was to understand that. And that was about the first 3 years of work. And when we thought, and we spent very little money on that. And when we thought, we think we know enough, again, enough to be dangerous, it's the right time to move on to the second question. Because we know enough about the seaweed, and we already knew enough about the engineering and scaling approaches that are used, could we merge those? And could we find a way as quickly as we can to get to an answer that's going to stop the company or make it go forward? Is, can I do that at scale? Many companies fail when they move from bench scale or pilot scale to large commercial scale. And they fail for various reasons through there. It's one of those challenges that's always there for pretty well any category. We were no exception. So we managed to borrow equipment in various ways that I won't go into in depth, through interesting partnerships, so that we could take the seaweed we have, grow it at a much larger scale, and process it. It's the really important piece, process it into a finished product and sell that. Truly sell it to someone in the market, not give it to someone for trials, not give it to someone for free, do a marketable transaction where money changes hands. And we were able to do that, which for us what we call our commercial validation. First one being the technical validation, the commercial validation, and we're in now what I call the financial validation. And that means, can I do all of what I've just described and do it profitably? Because when you're building large scale manufacturing, it's a large cost for infrastructure. It's solar-like in the sense that you're building a lot of hardware in various parts of the world to do it. And it's not inexpensive. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars to begin to really build a very large scale. And of course, people are magnanimous, but no one's giving you hundreds of millions of dollars if you're not profitable. So that's a critically important question. And by that, Alex, it's really important that I mean, not only is it profitable for us, but it has to have value to the farmer. What we provide to that farmer that is going to use it on their cows, be they beef cows initially, which is where we are, or dairy cows in the future, or grazing beef cows in the future as well, it has to have a value equation for them. They have to put money in their pockets. It cannot be a tax to them, cannot be a cost to them. It is a cost initially to purchase it. They have to be able to recover that value back either in higher farm gate prices for the beef or milk, because it's now low in impact. We know that if you don't burp methane out, the carbon stays inside the cow that would normally be burped out as methane, and it provides a greater degree of efficiency. That's now being borne out in other independently run studies. So potentially there's a feed savings for the farmer to get the same amount of protein. And of course, there's value to the carbon that's reduced, or the methane carbon equivalents that are reduced. The combination of those has to put money in the farmer's pockets. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So we're in that phase now where we're doing all that. And the final piece, you have to be able to do that without the need for subsidies. You cannot rely upon government-based subsidies or farmer-based subsidies for this in here. It has to stand independently on its own. That can be big upside, but it can't be the basis for it. So long way of answering, hopefully, your question around how have we gone about it? Very systematically. It's probably part of the scientist in me, but very commercial focused, market driven, which is part of my large scale commercial background in here. And so merging those two has been, I think, an incredible advantage for us as we think about what we're building.
And as you're heading, I mean, we want the next question will be on capital, but just before we get into kind of accessing capital, what is the kind of scale difference between the volume of product versus the original seaweed that you're at right now versus where you need to get it to? I mean, I have no frame of reference for this. So what are the volumes we're talking about that you have been dealing with, and where do you need to get to, do you think?
It's a great question. The world today, and for the last 10 years of all of this research work that's going on in academic institutions and within now a growing number of companies looking into this space, has probably numbered in the low thousands of cows. So it's been good from a science standpoint, but certainly not sufficient. There are 1.5 billion cows on the planet. So 1,000, 1.5 billion, you get the scale question in here, which is why it's really been important for us to address the can I do it at scale and can I do it financially feasibly? We're building right now what we call an eco park, which is the complete end-to-end production, all the way from growing it. We grow it on land, by the way. We don't harvest any of it from the ocean. It's all on land, which adds to the cost, which adds to the complexity of answering that question about profitability and value add to the farmer. We think we've managed to be able to address that. And so you have this end-to-end process in an eco park, and the one we're building now is scaled for somewhere between 30 and 40,000 cows. Think of it as a unit, and you've been to build 10 units, 100 units, 1,000 units. They're the same. We've made it so that it's replicable, so therefore scalable in here, and you can understand the unit economics of a unit of an eco park, so to speak. So we're building that now in South Australia, in a relatively remote but adjacent to the ocean area, so we can bring the ocean water in for all of the seaweed growth that we grow in some proprietary vessels which have enabled us to bring the cost down compared to what the commercially feasible approaches are in here. And so that's 30,000 cows, and you think, well, it's still 1.5 billion. So we're working with commercial partners in parallel. I should say that first eco park, those 30,000 cows, all of the product has been pre-sold, 100% of it. There are 3 commercial partners for that, each taking 10,000 cows apiece. They're each 3 commercial beef feedlots in Australia, one in South Australia, one in New South Wales, and one in Queensland. And they've all been announced, so there's nothing secretive about that. We also announced in the latter part of last year the phase after that. So this is why we need the really tight validation on these financials, like a project pro forma, as it would be called. Not just a feasibility, but an engineering design and a very detailed financial pro forma, which we'll have here in the next 6 weeks or so complete. But we're doing that because we've also partnered with a major global food and beverage and trading company called Lotte International, South Korea headquartered, and we announced that last year. But the goal of that partnership is to supply up to 4 million cattle in South Korea, which is all of the cows in South Korea. So on a country level basis, as well as on a large scale commercial partner basis. But 4 million is a big step up from 30 to 40,000. But as I said, this pro forma, which is the metrics on the eco park we make today, is equally applicable to 100-fold the scale. So we can go from 30 to 40,000 to 4 million. Now we'll build that 4 million in a couple of different tranche sizes, but I can now turn to large scale commercial lenders who we're now beginning to work with and say, unit economics says that this is profitable. Great gross margins, great profit profile in here, and we work with them to arrange to access that capital to begin building that next stage of scaling in here, which should begin in the early part of 2025.
I just want to take this opportunity to thank our production partner and sponsor, Jano Media, for their support in delivering the Decarb Connect podcast. Over the last few years, they've helped us to facilitate great conversations that connect us with our audience, and their skills and expertise mean that we get to concentrate exclusively on generating the content, the conversations that engage, inform, and inspire. So the eco park for the 30 or 40,000 head of cattle feed that you have now, one of the questions that we get asked a lot, or we ask of people a lot in the CO2 space is, well, what kind of space does that take up? You know, because when you're talking carbon capture, mini plants or something, everyone cares about the space. What's the space requirement of that? And do you see that shifting as you scale?
It's probably easier if I dimension it on the physical space of something else. And knowing that your listeners may be all over the world, I apologize to some of them for the analogy that I'm about to make. If we thought, and again, I live in the US, although I'm Australian, but I live in the US. So I'll use a US analogy in here. There are about 94 million cows in the US, so we could round it to 100 million. Substantial in size, certainly not the largest market. Brazil and India have the 2 largest markets, but the US is certainly up there. To build the capacity on land for the end-to-end, for that in its entirety, the footprint of that would be about the size of Chicago's O'Hare Airport. Not the building, but the runways and everything. So that's the dimension on size. It's large, but it's not massively large. And we don't build it in urban areas. In fact, we want it in places that are generally low cost, obviously from a cost standpoint, but marginal land, something that isn't used for anything else. We've gone on record publicly, and we'll make it clear, we won't build anywhere where it would take away food or food production, either for animals or for humans. We will not build anywhere where we have to access water. While we take from the ocean, there are possibilities of using underground aquifers that are saline, not water. So from our standpoint, we will not compromise the food or water systems that we rely upon today as humans for our own sustenance and for animals in that context. It's incredibly important. So that's about the way I can dimension the sizes. The first one that we're building now is somewhere about 4 or 5 hectares.
Okay. I think that's a good visual of the Chicago ahead, because as you say, it's a massive site, but it's not, when you put it in the context of the industry around cattle in the US.
It's not even a point of a pin on that map, as you said, compared to the land that's currently used for cattle grazing.
So you are on this journey at the moment to access the capital you're going to need to build this next phase and future phases of capacity. Tell us a little bit about who or how have you supported this financially so far, and what is it that you need from this next funding round?
So we started the company, as I said, about 5 years ago. The first, and it actually started because I was in New Zealand. It started as a New Zealand company. I was with a friend sitting next to me that I shared the idea with, and he effectively said, "I'm in." And he was working with 3 other local New Zealanders, all quite prominent Maori within the community. And I had known them, and we collectively formed the company on that day, very, very end of 2018. And it's evolved. And as we've required more capital, the first phase was the friends and family phase. Folks that they typically knew across New Zealand because they were relatively well integrated into the innovation ecosystem and other areas. And so we managed to raise a couple $2 million US dollar equivalents in New Zealand that kept us going through those first few years that were quite lean, as I said, because we were leveraging other people's assets with their partnership and knowledge, of course, in a way to build that real key question is, do we know enough to be dangerous about what we're doing? And as we turn to the need to move to larger scales, the traditional seed round, the traditional venture capital A round and B round in here, we knew that that capital was going to be more challenging to raise in New Zealand because of a much smaller ecosystem in terms of it. And I lived in California at that stage. As you said, I now live in Nevada in Las Vegas, but I lived in California in the middle of Silicon Valley and was relatively well connected there. And so we moved the company to be a USC Delaware corporation. We still have a wholly owned New Zealand subsidiary and a wholly owned Australian subsidiary of the company, but it's a C Delaware company that raises the money. And we were successful at raising a seed round. It's a combination of money from the US and from New Zealand, none from Australia, interestingly. And that got us through, about another year's worth of work on this, can I do it at scale question? But that made it, we now needed to get serious about capital raising. So we raised a Series A, first traditional Series A, which was about 17 or so million dollars US. And in fact, we've just completed a Series B that was about 34 million or so, an additional 34 million. So we've raised somewhere about 55 million US over the time of the company to date. There are some things we have in the works right now that aren't finished yet, and that's really been as we've accelerated the questions that we have and the knowledge that we have and the successes in what we've learned, we've been able to match that with the capital. It's been incredibly challenging really through COVID. And coming out of COVID, the economics, as we know, if we go to the grocery store, are still challenging for everyone personally, but they certainly have been in terms of companies raising money. The venture capital industry is down dramatically in some sectors, up to 50%. And even within there, companies who are raising money have significant challenges. I was at the Animal Ag Tech conference in San Francisco last week. There was a panel with 5 venture capitalists representing across Europe and the US. And the host, one of those, asked a question, which for them required a single yes or no answer. In 2024, and they were speaking from their experience in the animal ag tech space, which we fall into, would at least half of the companies fail to raise capital in 2024? And every single one of them said yes. Now, will some raise it? Of course. But what that means is they're seeing a real challenge, not only in their ability to raise money, but their ability to be able to put capital out. And so some great ideas and some great opportunities may not get funded this year as they didn't last year. So this is the challenge that everything has. We were fortunate to have raised this capital and finished that round up at the very end of last year, and we have a couple of interesting things in the works. And for us, I think that speaks to the story, the impact, the people who are running it, and the size of the market. And bringing all of those together and being able to show you can do it profitably and in a value add to the farmer without subsidies, that's really bringing all of those elements together. So that's what I talk when I talk publicly and when I talk with investors. And people get it. They're hungry to make a difference. There is lots of capital around. It's just hard to prize it out at the moment. So
yes, we hear that a lot on the CO2 side as well. More and more funds, more and more types of funds coming to, showing an interest in hard tech in the CO2 space, but in other forms of tech, but just taking longer to make those decisions.
We have the additional challenge in this particular space and others like us is it's very capital intensive. Let's get really clear. It's not a software company where capital for hard tech is not required. We build physical assets that have all sorts of complexities to them that rely upon, important engineering constructs to build. And that's capital intensive. And that's always in venture has been, the industry has generally shied away from those capital intensive areas, but I think are now moving more. There are more and more dedicated funds into this climate aspect space broadly. And I think many of them realize we can't solve it with a piece of software. Software can certainly help understand efficiencies and perhaps even utilizing some aspects of artificial intelligence point us in directions, but we still have to build stuff, and building stuff is money that has to be used for it in here. So the bar has probably been raised several levels, not only in venture capital broadly, in the space of climate and in the space where you have to build assets in here. So as I said, we feel very fortunate to continue to be on the journey and continue our path at the moment. So
you've mentioned a couple of times that the economics of what you're building are designed to not remotely rely on incentives or anything like that. But I'm still going to ask you the regulatory question, because I'm sure, like most entrepreneurs, you have a view on what the regulatory change might be that could really make a difference in the commercialization of tech like yours. So doesn't have to only be in your direct space, but what is there something, or do you see something emerging that would help with better commercialization?
Yeah, yes is the broad answer across most geographies. There has been a significant movement, which is really satisfying and gratifying to see governments moving in the direction, but they're not doing it because they're being magnanimous. At the end of the day, think about it this way, Alex. Just one example. If cows produce that magnitude of impact, and it's not to say cows are bad. Trust me, I'm nowhere, I need to make this really clear. Nowhere am I saying, let's get rid of cows. They're a fundamental piece of our food chain, and they will be for decades longer. Will we transition our food programs? Absolutely, yes, to become more efficient at what protein we grow and how we source it and the types of foods we eat. But today, that's not feasible. So today we have cows. Whether we all like it or not, they're there. And so we're trying to help make them better in the sense that we're lessening the impact they have on climate change. And we're doing this to be, the best way to put it is, a friend of the farmer. We have to make sure, it's part of our mission to make sure that it is a net positive return on investment for those farmers to use it. That's critical in here, because the whole ecosystem doesn't work if there's a challenge in the farmer saying, why should I take that cost on? It's absolutely a fair question, and we don't believe they should. So that's really what's led us to here. Now, when you think about this question of impact, and you think about the number of cows, and again, I'll use the US, those 94 million cows, the US, along with 150 other countries, about 2 years ago, a bit more than two, announced this global methane pledge. How do we as a country reduce 30%? And that was the pledge. 150 plus countries have pledged to reduce their methane emissions by 30%. Well, how do you do that? You have oil and gas. Certainly people can point a finger and say, fix your leaky oil wells, fix your leaky pipelines. Well, that doesn't work so well. You can regulate that. There's been challenges, let's say, politically to being able to do that. But you've also got these ruminants, cows, and it's not just cows, it's sheep and goats and camels and deer, and the list goes on. Those with 4 stomachs, the ruminant animals in here. But cows are the largest by population and the largest by the amount of methane they put out. So if you're a country and you addressed, a reduction of 80%, 90% of the methane from your ruminants, you might get close to perhaps even achieve your 30% methane goal. That's not lost on regulators around the world. It's like, I should think about how I might be able to be forward thinking around this in here. We need to change our food systems. I should think about that. So there are multiple motivations that are going on in different parts of the world. In Australia, one can both sell commercially and make the claims today. We're working in South Korea with our commercial partner with Lotte on the regulations there, and we fully expect by the end of the year there will be a very clear and defined pathway to be for our product in our use situations, not for all products. Everyone else will have to go through that, like you do in pretty well every other geography. In the US, last year, there was a bipartisan bill put together that's making its way now through government, although, again, a challenging time for them with the US elections coming up, given you need Republicans and Democrats to vote to make this happen without fighting over other things. But nevertheless, the idea was to create a completely new category where a feed additive like this is not regulated as an FDA-regulated drug, which is how it would be today. So they've recognized we need to do this. We're going to do it with some form of expediency, and it's going to be much more streamlined in terms of what happens for approvals. The same is true in Europe. Different mechanism, but it's really moved along very, very significantly about how do you think about seaweeds broadly, and this particular one in the context of animal feed additives in here and their impacts. So in a variety of geographies, it's certainly moving. And I think many other countries, like they always do, are looking to those major jurisdictions to say, I see what you've done, and we'll sort of make the relevant adaptations. But the impact of that 30% should not be lost on people as a motivating factor, now that there is a way to be able to address it. 2 years ago, no way to address it. No way anyone's going to go put anything politically in place. But today, now we know we can.
Okay, well, thank you, Steve, for not just sort of walking us through what the platform is and does, but I think that piece on how you've gone about scaling, how you've really put the economics and the market and the commerciality of it up front, not just got wonderfully obsessed by the beautiful technology or beautiful opportunity, which is obviously a pitfall for many early stage companies. I think that's been great. So what's next for you? And I'm going to tag on to that. Do you have a call to action, or do you have something that you just like to see? You mentioned what you'd love to see from government. What would you like to see from those in the agriculture or investment space as well?
Wow, that's a lot of questions for us. So what next for us? I think there are sort of 3 buckets of things that are worth calling out. One is we have to build this facility. It's under construction now. We have to be on budget and on time, i.e. by the end of the calendar year for the money that we've already allocated. It's paid for. Don't have to borrow money for it. It's paid for. It'll be built. All the regulations are in place. We have all the permits. Ground is already being prepped in here. So earthworks is underway. That's one. Execute with excellence. 2 is we have to continue to build the very select and strategic partnerships for the next phase of scaling. Those who are credible, those who can impact scale by their size. To that point, we don't sell to individual farmers. It's a choice we've made. We don't build a facility and say, who wants to buy some? We build a unique partnership or relationship with like Lotte, or in some cases, other large companies, or perhaps other large governments to supply at scale. So we need to continue to build those, and we'll have some exciting announcements coming out for the rest of 2024 that'll showcase that. It'll take us from 4 million cattle up into the tens of millions in this next phase. And the third is to continue the science. It's not settled. It's not, this is the one thing. How do we continue to do what we've always done, is focused on bringing costs down, whether it's through the engineering approaches of how we process it, how we grow it, understanding more of the biology, how can we improve the yields of these actives within the species, how could we perhaps put other materials with it that can lower the amount of seaweed, but still maintain that benefit. There are a multitude of scientific pillars that go behind what we do and underscore it. So they're the three things for us that are really important, and broaden our market. That enables us to broaden the market from beef feedlot today to dairy cow in the first quarter of next year, grazing dairy cows, I mean, like we would have in New Zealand or in Ireland. That's the predominant types. And then another year to a year and a half after that, moving into the grazing beef cattle market, which is what about 1 billion of those 1.5 billion cows on the planet are. It's an incredibly important focus for us, but you have to build to it with what you do. So that's what's for us. Call to action question. It's a really interesting one, and in the back of my mind while I was answering that last one, I'm sort of processing how to answer that. I think we have to get realistic and practical today on what we can do to impact by 2030. The governments of the world, and almost all of them with a few exceptions, agreed in Paris in 2015 to reduce dramatically by 2030 our greenhouse gases in order to achieve a 1.5 target, or ideally less than a 2° centigrade warming. Now, when you say it that way, it all sounds, but it's a 1.5° centigrade or a 2° centigrade warming of our natural world. And people say, well, I go outside and look, it's 17 today and it's 19 tomorrow. It seems okay. But this is an average we're talking. And when you hear stories about glacial melting and reductions in glacial and snow in Switzerland, when you hear that Greenland is warming at 3 to 4 times faster and melting than what was expected from a science basis, when you're in Antarctica, I was there last month, and you see the dramatic evidence of changes in water. When you have fishery groups who are growing some of the seafood that we eat, having to move to other waters because it's warming too much in the region they're doing it. When you see the changes in weather patterns that we're having that are disturbing, it's not about global warming. Again, science wasn't real good about coming up with the ways to convey it to consumers, right? I got snow today. There goes global warming. We have to stop all of those arguments. There's no question Earth goes through cyclical patterns. And I think on the evidence today, there's no question that we are facilitating this next phase, facilitating its onset. We are not a species that adapts in decades. We're a species that adapts over centuries and centuries. We bring it on faster, we're going to cause a significant disruption to planetary ecosystems and ourselves. So the call to action really is, what can we do between now and 2030 to have an impact in 2030? And that's really the piece that's important. If you think about CO2, we could stop fossil fuels. That would have an impact, but that's not going to happen. I'm sitting here in my office and I'm looking around, and 90% of the things in front of me are derived from fossil fuels. Plastics or resins in one way, shape, or form. If I got in my car, it would be the same thing. If I walked down to the shops, it would be the same thing. We can't do that today because we don't have sufficiency in the systems to enable us to live how we're living today and continue that on. Now, That then flips to, well, we could all change how we live today. I'm a practical realist. That's not going to happen today. Human behavior will not allow that. Might be great, and we have people calling out to do it, but it's not going to happen. So let's get realistic about what we can do. Building wind, building solar, building battery storage have been great. We've spent several $1 trillion on that. It has not moved the needle of CO2 down one fraction, period. We just have to recognize that. We talk about, I've built so many terawatts of systems, so many gigawatts of systems. These are all good, but this is a decades-long transition. This is not a 2030. This cannot happen by 2030. We don't have the systems to enable us to scale those and without dramatically impacting human life. And you do that, the governments who did that will vote you out the next cycle. So again, it's the practicalities, and you sit down and say, what is going to happen? What can we happen? So that's, I think, to me, is call to action is like focus, almost like the Manhattan-like project. What can we do, and how do we put the right resources against what we can do that we absolutely know will have an impact by 2030 on greenhouse gas levels, not on other systems that might ultimately lead to it. Long story, and I apologize to your listeners for that in here, but get behind what can happen and impact greenhouse gas levels in the next 5 to 6 years. Because again, science has set those limits of 2030. It's not some magical date where some fundamental thing happens. It was intended to be, when do planetary systems and the complexities of those that drive our weather, and our weather drives the patterns where we can grow food and where we can live. And so when those change, and they will change, there's no question of that. The question is when. It'll change planetary migration of people, where we can grow food, where there is or isn't viable systems to be able to do that from a weather standpoint. And while we sit here today, we think, oh, that's a long way off. That's the whole point. When these planetary systems go through a disruption, it's not linear. It's a systems change. And when that happens, it's going to dramatically affect us in ways that I don't think we're prepared for today. And in order to give us the best shot, we should be preparing for it, what's called adaptation, but we should also be putting things in scale that can get us to there. And we're not doing that today. We're betting on everything. It's like I'm walking up to the roulette table and I'm putting chips on every single number that there is. Nothing wrong with that. But when you have a sense of urgency, you need to sort of be able to figure out, where am I going to put them that gives me the greatest ability for a return? And the return is not financial. Yes, it is. Let's be practical. But the return is impact on human civilization and our ability to live the lives that we live and continue to do better for ourselves. So.
Well, I think that's a powerful way to close this. So, Steve, thank you so much. Really, I knew I'd enjoy talking this through with you, and I have, and just really fascinating to see that real laser-like focus on the commercials and the economics of the technology that you're bringing to market, hand in hand with something that really does have the potential to have a big outsized impact. So thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Alex, for taking the time, and for the listeners, for those who made it through, for listening, and hopefully you found this interesting and impactful. Appreciate it very, very much. Thank you.
At Jano Media, we recognise that great content has the power to create impactful and positive change for lives and society. Whether that's video, live streams, photography or podcasts, partnering with us will enable you to harness the power of content to engage, inform, and inspire. Reach out to us today.